Right. Hi, everyone. In this video, I want us to have a look at which topic is it? I believe it is 4.7. Describe the causes of tension between economy and ecology and suggest government policies to solve these conflicts. Okay, so we'll basically have two parts in this video. One during which we will go through some of the main reasons for which there can be a tension, so the causes, and the second part when we will go through the solutions. Um, Perhaps the first thing you should mention, if you have a question like that, is to talk about something that we've already encountered before, which are negative externalities. So mostly whenever we talk about the environment, mostly negative externalities in production. It could also be in consumption. Remember, this is a situation where the actions by one economic agent will have a negative impact that we call the external cost on another economic agent. It can be the direct consequence of a production activity, um, like industrial pollution, basically, or it can be the consequence of a consumption activities. For example, when you drive your car, you don't produce your car, but you use it, and as you use it, you generate pollution. Okay, so these are examples of negative externalities, and there are many examples that you can provide of externalities, either in consumption or production, that will cause a damage on the environment. Okay, so that's a good start, and perhaps you could even draw the diagram of a, say, negative production externality. Remember that this is something that we've already described in the video on market failures, which was topic 2.7, so you already have some content about that. But of course, there are like the tension between economy and the ecology, the environment, basically, goes a bit beyond this externality, and there are so many different things that you can discuss during the presentation. So I'm going to just make a list of different items that I find relevant, or different points that I find relevant. Of course, you don't have to remember them all. Just pick the ones that you feel are the most interesting, the ones that you remember the best, and perhaps the ones for which you find it easier to find examples. Right, a first example of tension is, of course, the question of land use, because there is a competition between the use that we make of the land for, let's say, our like the uses of humanity and the uses of the world economy, like to build cities, to build transportation infrastructure, or simply to like exploit those natural resources. There's the example of deforestation, for example, for palm oil production, which tends to be like a very severe issue in Indonesia. Why is this a tension? Because of course, the more we want to produce, the more natural resources we need. And clearly, in order for us to be able to use those natural resources, to exploit them, well, we need to destroy some natural habitats where there are a lot of species, either like living organisms that just live in these natural habitats and that can be endangered. And that's one reason for which we have witnessed a very severe or dramatic loss in biodiversity, because there is just the area that has been conserved and where animals and plants can live have shrunk very significantly since the last 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution. So that definitely something can discuss, like the urbanization process. As the economies as they grow, you have cities that become larger and larger, and of course there is less land available for like green land, like for natural habitats. That's clearly a problem that you can raise. Um, Talking about negative externalities, of course, you should talk about, just one example, greenhouse gases and climate change, which is, of course, something that is probably one of the most significant issue that we'll have to face and hopefully solve in the next decades and the next centuries. So of course, greenhouse gases like CO2, like methane also, we know that since the Industrial Revolution, as our economies have um, experienced very fast economic growth, we've also increased the amount of greenhouse gases that we have emitted. In fact, there is a direct relationship between GDP and emissions. Okay, for a simple reason is that the key driver of economic growth is energy. The more energy we use, the more energy we consume, basically, the more we can produce. Okay, because what we have to understand is that since the last 200 years, machines have been the key driver of economic growth around the world. And well, machines, they need energy to function. And most of the energy that is used in the world as of today, since the Industrial Revolution, comes from fossil fuels. So essentially, coal, gas, and oil, which are pretty important greenhouse gases emitters. There is also the issue with methane, which is another greenhouse gas that is mostly caused by the production of meat and especially the production of beef. And as economies, as the world economy has increased, as incomes have increased, people have started to consume much more meat than before. And so the production of beef has increased very significantly. And of course, that is clearly something that has contributed to increases in greenhouses emissions. Again, as economies grew, as incomes increased, as people had higher living standards, they also they were able to travel more often, like either for leisure purposes or even for work. They were now able to live further away from their work. Like if you look at 200 years ago, this never really happened. You always live very close to where you live, but with the development of like modern transportation systems, with especially the private car, we now have people who travel more and more often for longer and longer distances, and that's also a key driver of those greenhouse gases emissions. So of course, that's something that is extremely concerning, especially as it is something that can affect the entire economy. It will decrease the productivity of land in certain areas. You know that there are certain areas that will become too dry, for example, so we will not be able to grow anything in these areas. On the other hand, there are some areas that will become too humid or too cold or too hot. Well, basically, you understand that this is going to have like a major consequence on the world economy in the future, as the productivity of certain natural resources will be very severely affected. Okay, you probably know enough about climate change and the consequences, so I don't really need to tell you too much about what these consequences are. Right, let me just focus on the key elements. There's also the issue of waste, which is central to understand the consequences, the economic consequence, the environmental consequences of having growing economies. Because as economies grow, we also generate more and more waste, which can have very significant on a very negative impact on biodiversity, on the food chain. For example, all the plastic we have in the ocean, which is directly generated like by well, our industries, and that's clearly something that we will have to address. So you can definitely talk about that, especially talk about like the issue of plastic pollution, but also other forms of pollution like soil production pollution, water pollution as well. The issue of biodiversity, do not forget to talk about this, biodiversity, like the fact that we have every year more and more plants that become extinct, that just disappear again because of the pollution, because of the disruption of the food chain, because of the competition in terms of natural habitat. Why does it matter? Let me just give you one example, which has to do with something that we call the option value. The option value is basically the idea that it's we are unable to measure the true value of like living organisms, like animals, like plants, because as scientific knowledge improves, we may certainly realize that some like DNA or like some living organisms that became extinct could have potentially helped us to say develop new medication, new drugs. But because they are gone, because they are extinct, because this is something that is irreversible, we basically lost something. Let me just give you a simple example. Perhaps, maybe, who knows, 50 years ago, maybe there was a type of fish that had in its DNA the secrets to cure cancers. We don't know, right? Because maybe this fish has disappeared because of overfishing, like those massive fishing boats that just fish too much and do not give sufficient time for the fish stock to regenerate, for the fish to reproduce itself, basically. But maybe we had this species of fish that had like special biological features, and if scientists today, if they could analyze its DNA, maybe they would just find the secret to, a medication, a vaccine that would cure either AIDS or cancers. But because we've killed this species, we will never know because this is irreversible. That's this like losing a species extinction is something that we can't really undo. And the idea of the option value is basically that, since we don't know how valuable a species can be to us in terms of like, medication, for example, we should protect it. Maybe it doesn't really have any value for us, may have value in itself, okay, but for us, for human societies. But since we don't know yet, maybe we will be able to find out. We should protect it. We should preserve it. So that's why the protection of biodiversity, or that's one reason, of course, the protection of biodiversity matters so much. Okay, something that you should also discuss is really the idea of competition for natural resources. Because initially, like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, basically we had enough of everything. Okay, the world economy was still quite small. We had plenty of fossil fuels. We had plenty of mineral resources, rare earth elements. We just started to exploit those minerals, those fossil fuels, those metals. And so there was not much competition. So, of course, you had countries that had more than others, but the world economy was still relatively small compared to the amount of natural resources that was available. So yeah, in terms of geopolitical tensions, in terms of competition, in terms of scarcity, um, we did not have like such an issue. But now, as the world economy has become massive compared to what our planet can provide, there is clearly a much tougher competition in terms of natural resources. So it could be oil, could be coal, could be what we call those rare earth elements, those minerals, copper, um, nickel, all of these elements that are used, for example, to make cell phones, to make processors, these elements have become very, very scarce. And something that is quite interesting, like an interesting feature, is that you don't really choose whether or not you want to produce them, right? It's basically depends on the underground. Okay, do you have some of these resources or not? And that's something that can really increase the level of political tensions, geopolitical tensions between countries, and trigger conflicts, because uh, there is so much at stake in terms of controlling or accessing these natural resources that have become so valuable in our world economy. And this is something that can potentially create some instability in the decades to come. You may know, I don't know if you do, but you may know that we have reached something that we call peak oil. Peak oil refers to the year during which we had reached the maximum production of oil worldwide. And we can talk about that. That's quite interesting, in my opinion. Peak oil. Peak oil, so it took place in 2008. It is the year during which we had extracted the most oil worldwide. And since 2008, the amount of oil that we extract every year globally in the world is gradually going down, decreasing. And it is scheduled to continue going down, which is, of course, a very serious issue because, like I said, the main determinant of GDP, economic growth, is energy. And the main source of energy right now in the world is oil. So how can we sustain economic growth if we can't sustain oil production? How can we keep growing if we produce less oil? And the answer is, well, we will probably be unable to to uh, to keep growing in a world where oil production decreases. So then you'll tell me, okay, but perhaps we can find some substitutes. Yeah, okay, possibly, and that's one reason for which we are developing, and we'll talk about the solutions later, renewable energies, electric vehicles, and all. But still, we'll see that that's just not going to be possible. It's just going to be something that's going to mitigate the reduction in the world GDP, but it's not going to compensate it or prevent the world economy to shrink because of this lower energy supply. Something else that is quite interesting is it's a nice example that I like to give my students because it really helps to understand what problems we are the world economy, what environmental problems the world economy faces right now. It's the productivity of mines. And one example that I like to give is the example of copper mines, mines that produce copper. The first copper mines that was open, I don't really remember the year, but this was probably 150 years ago, something like that, had copper content that was close to 30%. What it means is that for every ton of earth that was excavated, there was 300 kilograms of copper, which is huge. Now, because of course, we've already used all of the very rich or productive deposits, right? First you get copper where there is plenty, and then once you've used the copper in one particular area, you just go look in another area. But we've done that for 150 years. So all the good deposits where the copper content was like super high have now been used and are now depleted, which means that now if we want to keep extracting more of these natural resources, okay, I'm talking about everything, right? Copper, but pretty much everything else, it's more difficult and we need to go to places where the copper content is just much smaller. Right now, in like the current mines, the copper content is around 0.1%. So it decreased from 30% to now 0.1%, which is also something that emphasized that, well, we are also competing. So what I'm talking about is basically non-renewable resources. That's the issue of non-renewable resources. those non-renewable resources are resources that are only available in a fixed supply. Okay, it doesn't have the ability to regenerate itself, or at least it would take too long. So we basically take the supply as fixed, and we just keep using them. And again, at first, we just go for the places where there's plenty of this resource. But then gradually, as we use it up more and more, like the stock that is left remains smaller and smaller, and it becomes more and more difficult. So we say that there is typically decreasing returns. Decreasing returns suggest that, yeah, it becomes more and more difficult to extract natural resources. Another example is about oil. Well, at first, when we started to dig some wells to extract oils, we started to dig not that deep, right? We started to exploit oil from deposits that were not very deep underground, just a few hundred meters, mostly under the ground, not underwater, because it's technically much easier. But then as soon as we had extracted all of this cheap and easy oil, we had to dig deeper, we had to dig under the water, which was technically much more expensive. Now we are even considering digging under the ice. So you see the point, we dig deeper, so it's more expensive. It's just more difficult to extract it. Now we are digging like almost 10 kilometers deep to try to find oil and to extract it. So it gets more and more difficult to get to these non-renewable resources because we've extracted most of them, or at least maybe there is plenty left, but it's just too deep or too difficult to access, so we can't even access them. So that's also something that is a problem because, yeah, it means that it gets more and more difficult to get those resources, so it gets more and more expensive to produce, essentially. And something else that you can discuss that I find interesting is the idea that that's at least a problem between the economy and ecology is that there is a prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is the idea that, of course, collectively, we understand that if we look at the world altogether, it is in everybody's interest to just take actions that would be in favor of the environment, right? To protect the environment. So we understand that collectively we would all win from agreeing to this type of to make this type of agreement. The problem is that individually, each country has an incentive to keep producing as much as possible, to enjoy the highest possible rates of economic growth, without really caring for the environment and just saying, oh well, maybe the other countries, they'll do that. I want to produce, and of course, when I produce, I pollute. So basically, everybody expects or counts on the other countries to make an effort to reduce their carbon footprint, to reduce their environmental impact. But of course, if everybody does that, if everybody say, oh, other countries will do it, I don't want to do it, and as a result, nobody makes any effort to take actions to conserve the environment, to reduce their environmental impact, we end up in a situation where everybody behaves like a predator towards the environment. It's the same problem with public goods when you think about it. In the case of public goods, everybody wants to free ride, right? Nobody wants to pay. Nobody wants to contribute to provide public goods. Everybody is just expecting that other people will pay. That's pretty much the same problem we are stuck in the case of environment. Every country to say, yeah, sure, the environment, it's great, but the effort they want to make is minimal because they would rather try to grow so the country so people can have high living standards, they can reduce unemployment. But yeah, and we'll talk about the solutions, but that's really something that causes tension between the environment and the ecology, because there is this incentive to free ride and just count on other countries to take actions. Okay, something else that you should mention, because it's just an interesting keyword, is what we call the pollution havens. So the pollution havens are like an interesting consequence of globalization. These are basically countries, and maybe I mentioned them before, these are basically countries, often poor countries, that have very low environmental standards, that low regulations. Essentially, they accept all forms of pollution. Well, I'm exaggerating, but countries that have very little, very loose environmental policies, and that welcome foreign investments, usually from developed countries, to open, say, factories or businesses that pollute very much. Why does that happen? Because, of course, these factories or those businesses from rich countries, they can't really pollute in their home countries, usually, because in developed countries, environmental regulations are stricter, more stringent. And so they just outsource production, say, oh, we can't really produce at home. All right, well, we'll produce in a pollution haven. Why do these countries accept that? Because, well, it means an inflow of money. It means like factories, it means jobs, it means economic growth. So you see that there is this trade-off between, okay, well, we accept pollution, we accept damages being done upon our local environment, because it is something that can help to improve the economy. So that's an amazing example of a conflict between ecology and the environment. You have examples of Bangladesh, you have some examples in African countries where you have like local pollutions, like rivers being completely polluted because of like mostly chemical companies that just have like a very severe impact on the environment. Okay, so we've talked about non-renewable resources. A key word that you can use is really is unsustainability. Unsustainable. It's not really a point, but it's just a keyword. Make sure you talk about that. Unsustainable means it cannot be sustained, meaning we can't continue to operate the way we do. That's usually a situation where we use a resource too fast. Perhaps it has the ability to regenerate itself, like if you talk about fish, for example, fish or even trees, forests, they do have the ability to renew themselves, okay? But if we use them too fast because we want to grow too fast, so if economic growth is too rapid, we're going to use those resources at a rate that is going to be too fast, and the use of those natural resources is going to be unsustainable, which means that they renew themselves at a certain pace, but we use them at a pace that is higher. So we use them too fast, and at the end of the day, the stock is either going to be degraded or it's going to run. Well, the amount of the stock is going to be depleted after some time. So you should definitely talk about unsustainability, which is a good word to characterize, to describe the way in which we use most natural resources. Okay, so we talked about pollution, we talked about greenhouse gases, we talked about climate change, and of course the way in which it will affect the productivity of the land in many countries. Something else that is going to have like a pretty severe consequences will be climate migrations, because we know for a fact that in about 30 to 50 years from now, there will be hundreds of millions of people who will live in countries where, well, life will be hell, essentially, where the weather will simply make it impossible to survive many days every year. These are usually countries that are close to the equator. Because with the tropical weather that they have, the air is too humid, like it's like the saturated, and so if the air temperature rises above our body temperature, our body needs to cool down, and usually the way we do that is by sweating. But in those areas, because it's so humid, tropical areas, the air is already saturated in water, basically, because it's too humid, and though you can't sweat because it's already saturated, and your body can't cool down, and well, you can die essentially. And so we know that there are hundreds of millions of people who will have to migrate, to go somewhere else, either north or south, where it's less humid, where the climate is still going to be livable. And of course, this is going to have massive consequences in terms of our economies, in terms of political stability, in terms of the economy within those countries where people can't really survive. Uh, like so and countries like Indonesia, like the southern part of China, even like Central America or Central Africa, these are countries where life is going to be extremely complicated in 30, 50 years from now. And all of these movements of population will have extremely severe consequences, of course, on the economy, but beyond, on society, on the politics, on the stability, can create conflicts, something that you can also mention. Okay, just one data about Switzerland. The carbon footprint of a Swiss resident, it's 11.6 tons of equivalent CO2 per year, which is high. In France, it's 9.8. In the US, it's a bit more. I believe it is 13 or 15, but that's quite high. Well, simply because, and that's also something that can. It's a good example of the tension between the environment and the ecology, because it shows that the more income people have, the more they pollute. Well, of course, because we consume more, because we travel more, because we have more cars, we have bigger cars, we have bigger houses, so we need to, like, the heating is going to be more consuming. We buy more goods and services, and we have more leisure activities. All that, we live in countries where there are more infrastructure. So if you look at the carbon footprint of developed countries, it is always above like 7 or 8. If you look at the carbon footprint of most African countries, it is below 1, or below 1, below 2. So that's a good indicator of the tension between like the economy and like the quality of life, and also the impact that we have on our environment. Okay, so that's about it for the causes. So of course you don't have to talk about everything. I've talked for what, like 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes just on that. But this is just a range of interesting points about the tension between the economy and the environment. Now, solutions. Well, if I had a solution, I would get the Nobel Peace Prize right away. But not really solutions, but tools that can help. So I'll call that solutions, but really this is like things that could help. There is a wide range of things that we can do. So many things. First keyword that you really have to mention is the idea of sustainable growth or sustainable development. You've probably heard about that, en français, le développement durable. It has a very precise definition. Let me read it to you. So sustainable development was given by the UN, I believe. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present, us, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, okay? So we use natural resources so we can satisfy our needs, but we have to be mindful. We have to make sure that we live enough, basically, that we protect these natural resources so our children, our grandchildren, and all future generations will still be able to use them to satisfy their own needs and have like an acceptable quality of life. So you see that there is this idea that, okay, we should have like a long-term time horizon. We should not only focus on the economy like in the next 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years. It's irrelevant. We should really focus on like for several generations, just making sure that we take their interests into consideration. So how do we do that? Okay, that's basically our target, to have like sustainable growth, sustainable development. There are several things we can do. Of course, we can use taxes, which we sometimes call Pigovian tax. Pigovian taxes. Like one example is the carbon tax. All right, you pollute, you pay. That's the polluter pay principle. You pollute, you emit greenhouse gases. All right, then you do something bad for the environment, so we're going to tax you, and it's going to become more expensive because we tax you, and this is something that is expected to reduce the emissions of CO2. That's of course one solution. Something that is quite similar. Again, we are talking about emissions is like emissions permits. For example, in the EU, we have the European carbon market, where polluting firms need to purchase pollution permits to emit CO2. So because they need to purchase the right to pollute, that makes polluting expensive, whereas in most other countries, polluting is essentially free because you don't have to buy the right to pollute. So using like what we sometimes call tradable permits, because you can trade them, which means that, oh, if you have too many, because usually the government would give you some, okay, for free. If you have, or you could, or could be an auction, it depends. If you have too much, you haven't polluted as much as you are allowed to, you can sell the excess number of permits to firms who want to pollute more than the quota they were given. Okay, so these permits can be traded within firms, and that's a solution that works pretty well in the EU. We can use taxes. We can also use subsidies. What can we subsidize? Of course, you don't want to pollute. You don't want to subsidize something that is polluting. You want to subsidize an alternative, like could be like renewable energies. Oh, fossil fuels, they pollute a lot. Okay, yeah, let's subsidize like green, like renewable sources of energy, like solar farms or wind farms, or even nuclear power. Why not? We can also subsidize. So subsidies for renewable energies, but also that's just an example, right? We can also subsidize what we call low carbon innovations. You know, we often talk about technology and how technology will help us to solve this problem by just introducing some processes, some products that can do the same thing, but by having like a lower carbon footprint. Yeah, it can help. It's not gonna be sufficient, but it can help. So the government can like spend money in say research and development, can subsidize projects and support firms who just act in this, just take actions to develop, to introduce these low carbon innovations, green technologies. This can really help. Something else that can be used also to achieve sustainable growth, sustainable development, and something that we don't talk about it too often, we start to talk about it, is what we call green finance. Green finance. Because of course, if you understand that we need a lot of money to do that, to build new transportation infrastructure, to have like a new energy policy, to renovate all of those old buildings that are very poorly insulated. Okay, we need a lot of money. And therefore, we need to make sure that the financial markets or the financial world is also helping, right? Is also doing its part, is channeling the money towards this project. So we need to have like what we call green finance, which is essentially giving extra incentives for people who save, to save their money, or to make sure that their savings are used to finance those green projects, basically. So the idea is to make sure there is a gap between the interest rate that you receive when your money is used to finance green projects and the interest rate that you receive if your money is used to spend to finance other projects. Basically, you would receive some kind of a premium, like a high reward, a higher rate of interest, if your money is used to finance this energy transition, for example. So yeah, finance is also extremely important. Obviously, regulations are like a primary tool to reduce the environmental damage. Regulations, things that you must do or things that you must not do. A typical example of something that you, let's say, must not do could be some rules on, like in the EU, there will not be any more new petrol cars sold by 2035. It will be entirely electric vehicles. It's a regulation. It's a rule. Say, okay, we'll do that. All cars will be electric in 2035. That's a rule that we can implement to reduce the environmental impact. There can be, we can create more protected areas, so that's mostly to preserve the biodiversity, to create less competition between the, let's say, human use of lands, or like the exploitation of natural resources, basically to create some green land, or to produce some protected areas to make sure that plants, animals, they can live in peace, and that's to protect the biodiversity. We can, of course, resort to environmental awareness to just explain the problem to people, just like I hope I contribute to that, just to explain what the problem is, to make people understand what the problem is, and to give like some ideas on how we can address it, or at least how we can minimize the impact that these changes will have upon us in the future. So it could be through the government, could be through some NGOs, non-governmental agencies, could be consumer associations, could be a lot of different stakeholders, could be just concerned citizens, anybody who is interested in those issues and can contribute to improve the situation. Of course, we can have international cooperation. You've all heard about the COP, the conference on the parties. They meet every year, and they just so all countries, they meet and they try to strike some deals regarding the environment. It's not proven very effective so far, but at least they are trying. At least they are meeting. At least they are talking. At least they do try to look into the various steps that that can be taken to help addressing the various problems that we are dealing. So of course, this international cooperation is essential. Remember what I told you earlier, there is the prisoner's dilemma, where basically individually countries have an incentive not to do anything, not to contribute to reduce the problem. But if they all meet, if they all agree together, if they approach this problem collectively, this is something that can definitely help. Everybody has to contribute. The government has to do something, firms have to do something, and consumers have to do something. Changes in consumption patterns, that's also something that is extremely important for consumers to try to reduce their own carbon footprint, but just to make sure that their economic actions have the least possible effect on the environment. So it could be by cycling rather than taking a car to go to work, could be by avoiding traveling by plane, could be by purchasing an electric car rather than a petrol car, could be by avoiding consuming too much meat, could be by reducing the temperature inside during winter and increasing the temperature during summer. Could be things like that. Just reducing, in fact, it's not that hard to divide your carbon footprint by 2. It's definitely doable, but again, we all have an incentive to free ride, and we all have the feeling that, oh, but if I do it individually, well, that's not going to change anything because I'm just one among 8 billion. But well, of course, if everybody has that type of thinking, well, that's effectively not going to change anything. I've talked about renewable energies, for sure, yes. So solar power, geothermia, wind farms, nuclear power plants, not only renewable, but very low carbon footprint. And yeah, overall, public investment. Massive public investment in infrastructure. So there are a lot of areas where the government can invest to improve the situation. Could be transportation infrastructure to just to improve, for example, like to make cycling easier, to renovate buildings that have become too old and consume too much energy. Could be to subsidize or to invest in research and development so we can develop more low carbon innovation. And to some regulations, maybe one example of regulation would be to address planned obsolescence, which is, the idea that when you buy like a smartphone, like let's say the lifetime of your smartphone is typically limited. You're not going to keep it forever, for sure. And so that gives rise to a lot of waste. I believe there is over 1 billion smartphones produced every year in the world. So the idea would be to make sure that what we produce it for longer, that we can keep items for longer, so we don't waste as much natural resources. We don't create so much waste. So just increasing the lifetime of the products that we purchase, encouraging people to repair rather than replace, improve recycling, making sure that the products that we use are fully recyclable, or at least that they are as recyclable as possible. And maybe one last is, again, something that has to do with changes in consumption patterns. It's the idea of sobriety in consumption. Okay, just making sure that, again, there are some almost cultural changes in society where we will regard sobriety, which is the idea we just try to moderate our consumption, to reduce our consumption, where sobriety will be regarded as a virtue, as something positive. Okay, so instead of buying 20 pairs of shoes, to change phones every year, to just have like some kind of an excessive consumption, to try to reduce our consumption levels, and just, I'm not going to say buying only what is essential, but just trying not to buy things that are absolutely useless or less essential to us. That's clearly something that would help. Right. So these are possible solutions. Hopefully they will help reach something that we call decoupling. Decoupling, which means to separate. The objective is to separate, to allow the economy to develop, okay, the world to develop, the economy to grow, without increasing pollution and the environmental damage. Because for now, up to now, basically pollution, I'll do it this way, pollution and growth, they are very closely related, okay? We produce more, we pollute more. The idea behind decoupling is hopefully to find a way to make sure that we produce more, but we decrease our environmental impact. So far, we haven't really, like worldwide, we haven't yet managed to achieve this decoupling, to separate like the increase in production from an increase in pollution. Within certain countries, it was achieved. So there is hope that at the scale of the entire planet, we will be able to achieve this sustainable development and to decouple industrial production from environmental damage. That's essentially the hope that we can have. Right, that's about it for the tension between the ecology, the environment, and the economy.